Hello and welcome to Congressman Henry Cuellar's Capitol Report. Your voice from Washington for the 28th District of Texas.
Every day, taxpayers interact with the federal government on a regular basis, whether it's through the passport services, student loans through the direct loan program to pay for higher education.
Every month, we bring home to you the issues that matter the most. And now, here's your update from the nation's capital.
Hello, and welcome to Congressman Henry Cuellar's Capitol Report. My name is Riley Brands, and I'm here today with Congressman Henry Cuellar. We'll be discussing a number of issues of importance to the 28th District of Texas. First up, the highway bill, and then we'll be getting into some of the recent work on appropriations, as Mr. Cuellar is the only Texas Democrat on the House Appropriations Committee. So first, thank you, Congressman, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Riley.
Yeah, so first I was hoping we could start with the highway bill and how that's going to impact your district and how it's going to impact the nation as a whole.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I feel very optimistic about the highway bill passing. As you know, for many years we have not been able to pass a highway bill because there's just been a split between Democrats and Republicans, which is, again, not the right thing. You know, this is why people feel frustrated about Washington, because the basic work that we ought to do, like passing a highway bill that's so important to my district, so important to the state of Texas, to the nation, is one of those bills that should be bipartisan. So I feel this air of bipartisanship moving on this highway bill. What does it mean for let's talk about what does it mean for the state of Texas if we pass a highway bill. Right now, the state of Texas has been growing very fast. In the last 10 years, Texas grew by 4.3 million individuals. I think everybody sees that growth. Every year we get about $3 billion of federal tax dollars for the state of Texas. $3 billion, that's a lot of money. But when you have a large state like Texas and you have a fast-growing population, a lot of money, but not enough money itself there. So the reason we need the highway bill is because we need to bring more federal dollars in. Now, the state did a good job, and I've got to thank my former colleagues there, where they got a proposition passed that would allow new funding over a period of time, billions of dollars over a period of time, to provide extra funding. So there's efforts to bring in new dollars into the highway system. That means that what we need to do is to work on when the highway dollars, and we got to make sure they get to the right to the communities. Without due respect to the large urban areas, you're going to get those dollars. We understand that, but we can't forget about the small, medium-sized rural areas that need also highway dollars. So the money will come down to the Texas Department of Transportation. Then the Texas Department of Transportation will send it out to different projects within districts. In my congressional district, for example, there's a district in the Valley, then there's a highway district, and then there's a district in Laredo, then there's a district in San Antonio. So I got 3 different highway districts that I got to work with to make sure the dollars flow down to the parts of the area that I do represent. It means a lot for the state of Texas and for our area.
That could mean a lot, especially for Laredo, which is where you're from. And could you explain how it could especially help Laredo, given its status as a trade center?
Well, it's going to help really all border communities and up also. But one area that we are emphasizing is called the freight corridor section, which means that if you have trucks coming in, big 18-wheelers, you got to have a little bit more money for those highways, especially if we see the trade between the U.S. and Mexico has been growing over the last few years. Every day right now there's over $1.3 billion of trade between the U.S. and Mexico. It's estimated that in the next 5 years the trade between the U.S. and Mexico will grow by 40%. That means that an area like Laredo, which is the largest inland port, it's third largest overall after L.A., New York, then it's the city of Laredo. We handle about 40% of all the trade between the U.S. and Mexico. When we see 14,000 trailers a day, 14,000 trailers a day, literally if you stack those 18-wheelers in 1 year, they'll go around the world twice, which shows you the large volume of trade that we have. So freight corridors will provide targeted money for those couriers that will be designated freight corridors, and of course one of them is I-35, which means that it'll go from Laredo up through the rural areas, up to San Antonio, up to Austin, up to Dallas, and pretty much on those. And there's other freight corridors that we're looking at emphasizing also. So that's one of the efforts that I've been focused on, freight corridors for the state of Texas. It covers a lot of parts of the state of Texas. The other thing we're working on that I'm hoping we're successful in a bipartisan way with a couple other members is what we call the coordinated border infrastructure, which means that for the ports of entry, we got to put extra funding at those ports of entry for the infrastructure. A lot of people think about airports, seaports, which are very important, but land ports handle about 88% of all the people and all the goods coming into the United States, land ports. But the emphasis has not been on land ports, and we've got to do more for land ports, and this is what the highway bill is going to help us with.
So it's clearly going to have a positive impact across the state.
Oh, without a doubt, those freight corridors are going to be a lot, have a positive impact. But just bringing more money for public transportation, for maintenance of roads, for new construction, all that will mean new money's coming in. When you have new monies, more people get hired for construction jobs and that type of job creator fountain. So it's going to be more jobs and definitely a lot more money rolling in the Texas economy.
Great. I was hoping we could move over now to the funding of the federal government. So recently there was a 2-year budget deal passed. So can you explain how that worked and also what that'll mean for your work on the Appropriations Committee?
Right. Don't want to get technical, but let me get a little technical here. When people talk about a budget and people talk about appropriations in Washington, we're talking about two different things. The budget deal that was done for 2 years basically sets a top line, how much money will be spent over each year over a 2-year period. That is the Budget Committee. I got to serve on that Budget Committee my first term, and it's an exciting one because you get to see the whole federal government at work. The other one is the other committee that I'm in now is called the Appropriations Committee. That's the one that basically sets out the amount of funding for all the federal agencies and puts instructions or riders on how that money should be spent. It's interesting because I remember when I was in the state legislature, I served 10 years in the Appropriations Committee, and the fight was how much money do we add here, do we take here, do we add this, what do we do here? It was a money fight. In Washington, the money fight is there, but a lot of it now has shifted over to riders, instructions. Some of those riders have become very controversial. And I think part of it, Riley, is that people feel that if a lot of bills don't pass in Congress, which a lot of bills don't pass, the system is to kill bills. It's hard to pass a bill. So if you attach something, a rider, an amendment, an instruction to a bill that has to pass, like the appropriation bill. And I say appropriation bill, but again, we actually have 12 different appropriation bills, but at the end, we all put it together in one appropriation bills, and that funds basically, that funds everything dealing with the federal government. And so the fight has now been, instead of how much money is to put instructions or riders or amendments, and that's what the fight is. So in talking to some of my friends, other friends in the appropriations, basically we're going to add a certain amount of money, and then from there we have certain riders, and the riders are not controversial, are going to stay there, the ones that we've added, I'm talking about in the Appropriations Committee. And then the controversial ones are the ones that there's going to be a lot of discussion on. Planned Parenthood, maybe Syrian refugees, riders, Gitmo, guns, abortion, just name it. It's usually the controversial riders that will be addressed, either totally eliminated or adjusted somehow, a consensus reached. But most of those riders don't have controversy. We can talk about some of the riders that I worked on, and I don't think they're controversial, but I think they have a good impact on what we need to do.
Right. So before we do that, what's the general timeline for these appropriations?
We should have, the October 1st to September 30th is the fiscal year that we have for the federal government. But I can't think, at least since I've been here, we have not started October 1st and finished September 30th. It's usually done at the end of the year, getting close to Christmas. The timeline this year is to get it done before December 11th. Because we got a CR, we extended it. We extended the budget to December 11th, so we got to do this before December 11th. So the highway bill will be done before December 11th, and probably before. Then right after that, we'll do the appropriation bill. And I feel very optimistic that this time, in talking to Democrats and Republicans, it's moving toward a resolution on a highway bill and a omnibus appropriation bill. And the highway bill. The other thing, everybody wants money for their highways, but nobody wants to pay for it. So I do have to mention on the highway bill, it's for 6 years, but it only has funding for 3 years, which means at the end of 3 years, we got to come back and figure out what are we going to do about funding to fund the rest of the 3 years remaining on the 6-year term of the highway bill.
So speaking about some of the specific appropriations bills, obviously agriculture is one of the important issues in your district. So on agriculture, you've included a provision establishing a working group between the U.S. and Mexico to help facilitate and ease cross-border commerce. Can you explain how that would work and how that came about?
Yes. First of all, out of the $1.3 billion of trade between the U.S. and Mexico, there's a lot of agricultural products. Some coming into the United States from Mexico, some going south into Mexico from the United States. So if you ask our cattle or ask anybody in the agriculture in the state of Texas, Mexico is an important market, and certainly to Mexicans, the U.S. is a very important market for them. So basically, since there's a lot of trade, there's sometimes disruptions or delays at the border. So the purpose of this working group, Mexican-U.S. on agriculture, is how do we move those products faster? And if they're perishable, vegetables, fruits, then we got to make sure they don't get delayed, because if they get delayed, there's a problem. Or if they come in with a bug or some sort of insect, there's a problem. So we got to do a lot of checking before something goes out, something goes in, for our safety, for their safety. And that working group is to work on safety issues, to work on logistical issues, and make sure that those products get to our tables as we eat, or to the Mexican tables as they eat.
Yeah, another issue, of course, is energy and water development.
Yeah.
In
And let me, before we
yeah.
change ag, I know it's tied into that, but it's I added it somewhere else. But I added some language also to make sure that we work with the administration on immigrant folks that work in the fields, migrant workers that work in the fields. My father was my mother were migrant workers. And anybody who's been a migrant worker will tell you that it's a hard job. There's a lot of people that work. I mean, food just doesn't appear at our table. They don't appear at a store. Somebody has to pick them, somebody has to grow them, somebody has to take care of that. In growing fruit, there's pesticides that are used to kill insects, bugs, etc. And as they're sprayed, somebody has to work with them. There are times where kids work with the pesticides. So the language that I added, because it was personal, because my parents have been migrant workers, is to make sure that we have strong rules in place to protect adults, but especially kids. If you had your child, would you put them in a field, hot sun, working out there with pesticides, poisons that could kill that person or affect them? No, I don't think you would do that. So I think we need to take care of the kids of other folks, human beings, that are doing that also. So I added some language there to make sure that we work with the administration. I have strong language to protect, especially the young migrant workers, the kids that go work with their parents out there in those fields on that. So that's something that I take very personally, because I said my parents have been migrant workers, and I know that in my area there's kids that don't start school in August like a lot of kids do. Right. They start in September or a little bit later because they're working, and when they're somewhere in the north, and when they come back into Laredo or some other place, they're starting school late because they've been working out there. So not only are they affected at school, but we certainly don't want their health care to be affected or their care to be affected.
Right, right. So on the issue of energy and water development, you have language directing the International Boundary and Water Commission to make improvements to Falcon Dam on the Rio Grande and to look into risk mitigation at Amistad Dam, which is also on the Rio Grande. Can you explain that language and that work?
Well, we're hoping that we're successful on that in the sense that, and this all this is, it's the first step has been taken, but we got to make it final, and that's basically to make sure that those dams are safe and that the turbines are working well because they do create energy. And it's just make sure that we take that type of infrastructure because it's not only our roads, our highways, our bridges, but you got to take care of dams also. And that's why that language, we're going to work to see if we can keep it there.
Yeah, you've also been working a lot on veterans issues, not just recently, but across your career. So can you tell us a little bit about what you've been working on in appropriations for veterans affairs issues?
Well, different things. One is we certainly want to make sure that we provide the right health care, do everything timely because we don't want veterans to be delayed as they wait for their appeal, they wait for some health care. Things are getting better. I mean, they are getting better, and I know that in certain areas, the private sector hospitals have come in to supplement the work that the VA has not been able to do for several reasons. In there also, we've talked about cemeteries, and especially for the small rural areas, we got to look at some sort of rural cemeteries to address those concerns. Because some areas, the big urban areas, they'll have a veteran cemetery, and in some areas, because they're in a rural area, they can't get that. So we're trying to provide, saying that, we're going to try to go after, try to help the rural areas with veteran cemetery and hopefully have public-private partnership to help fund some of those cemeteries.
Yeah, and I know that one thing that we've seen in your VA work and that we've seen a lot of your other work too is trying to encourage federal agencies to work with Hispanic serving institutions or minority serving institutions. Can you explain sort of the impetus behind that and how you hope that those results can be achieved?
One of the fastest growing sector in our community is the Hispanic population, and so in my area it's Laredo, as my hometown, 96.6% Hispanic. It's the most Hispanic city percentage-wise in the whole country. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity, and we're saying that minorities like blacks or Hispanic serving institutions are able to have an opportunity. Nothing's guaranteed, but an opportunity to work with the VA, with the military, with other places, those universities that have a lot of Hispanics or minorities, that they are just given an opportunity like everybody. So it's not giving them special treatment, it's not doing that. We're just saying give them an opportunity to work with universities, whether it's UTSA San Antonio, or it's Incarnate Word, or it's Texas A&M International, or UT Rio Grande Valley. Different universities, that they're given that opportunity to work with those agencies.
Great. Could you tell us a little bit about your request for funding for new immigration judges?
Yes, especially now when we're seeing the issue of immigration. Right now, if a case, a judge is going to take one of the cases, it'll take a long time. 2 years, 3 years, maybe even 4 years. So as an attorney, I've always been taught that if you don't hear, a judge doesn't hear your case, your justice is delayed. So I requested language. I worked with my good friend John Cobleson, a Republican from Houston, and we were able to add money to add another 55 immigration judges. Is it enough? No. Is it a good step toward addressing the delays? Yes, it is. And those immigration judges are important because they have to make a decision. Does somebody stay or does somebody get returned? And that's the bottom line, is that we want to make sure that somebody makes that decision. Otherwise, people just stay here. And sometimes if they stay here and they see that nothing's going to happen, what do? When they get a court hearing, they're not going to show up. So we just want to say quickly, with all due process given, have a judge decide whether somebody stays or somebody goes under the current immigration laws that we have right now. So adding new judges will probably, I'm hoping we'll add about a quarter of them will go to Texas because, right now most of the immigrants are coming through Texas. And those judges are usually put either if there's a big immigration center, or if the immigrants go live in Houston or in Dallas, then you got to have those judges. San Antonio, you have those judges to address that. And certainly I want to see more judges on the border area also.
Right. You've also done some work in the defense appropriations bill in terms of drug interdiction or tackling drug trafficking. Could you explain that?
The National Guard with the Department of Defense plays an important role in fighting drugs coming in. They can do it by providing the intelligence, the work, or sometimes they do it by doing training. So there's different ways of doing. So we put an emphasis to make sure that they work with countries south of the U.S. And I've always said that when you address threats that come to the U.S. border, and keep in mind we spend about $18 billion on border security every year. Do you play defense on the 1-yard line, or do you play defense on their 20-yard line? And I think the more we push this away from the border, the better it is. And those are the things that we have to look at.
Right. On Homeland Security, you've been looking to get funding for a Southern Border Terrorism Threat Analysis report. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Those are issues that, I want Homeland to give us an analysis of what we have on the border. A lot of us know that if you look at FBI statistics, the border is safer than many other places. Right. Don't mean to pick on Washington, D.C., but I do work here. If you take Laredo, we had 1.2 murders per 100,000. You take the murders that we have here in Washington, where I work in D.C., it's 15.9, or let's say 16 murders per 100,000. So when I leave Laredo, which is on the border, the most dangerous thing I do is leave Laredo to come to work here in Washington, because it's, at least using the FBI statistics, it's more dangerous here, certainly more dangerous in other cities across. So I say this because a lot of people have a misconception of the border. And if you look at it, none of the 9/11 folks, the terrorists that came in and attacked us, none of them came through the southern border. In fact, the Wilson Center, Stratford, working with the Congressional Research Organization, we have found no links to people coming in through the southern border and terrorist events or attempts here in the United States. So I think it's good that we do that analysis so we can try to lay this to rest. Now, does it mean that we're not always careful? Of course. Could there be a possibility? Of course there is. But it's not the way people paint it, and this is one of the purposes why I want to ask this analysis.
Yeah, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'd love to hear more about your funding, or trying to get funding for a new courthouse in San Antonio.
Yeah. Well, the San Antonio court sits in a building that got built in 1968 or before 1968 for the 1968 World Hemisphere Fair that we had in San Antonio. It's a round building, so it's not set up for security purposes. There are a lot of, in talking to judges, talking to other folks, there are security concerns. The problem is that San Antonio, because of the criteria, was number 4 to be built, a new courthouse. Then the office, I'll call this the Office of Court Administration, changed the criteria, and we went down from number 4 to number 8. I asked them, how did that happen? And my analysis was, and them trying to answer that was, I saw that security was lowered down, which is amazing because, everything is about security, but they lowered that down. And then they also lowered the number of caseloads. We have more cases in the southern border area than almost any other place in the country. But nevertheless, what they did is they lowered the caseload and the security criteria down a smaller percentage. And therefore, San Antonio got brought down in ranking. So those are things we're hoping that we can change. We're going to try. Senator Cornyn, the San Antonio delegation, will be working very, very, very hard to make this happen.
And briefly, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but is there anything you'd like to highlight from your work on the Interior and Environment Department Appropriations Bill, as well as the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Bill?
Well, you know, again, since time's about to run out, let me just say this. I went through every appropriation bill and I looked for ways to address issues in those different bills, and that's what I did. And again, we'll find out by hopefully before December 11 what language got added, and then we'll go into more details at that time. But the whole purpose of this is, one, try to get funding into areas that will benefit the district, the state of Texas, the country, and then the other ones make some instructions, riders, to hopefully direct the money into certain areas that will get the job done.
Great. Congressman Henry Cuellar, thank you for joining us. Is there, where should viewers go if they are looking to find more information about your appropriations work or about your other legislative
work? Well, they can
work?
certainly get onto my website or contact any of my offices in Washington, D.C., and in San Antonio, and Laredo, in Mission, Rio Grande, Roma. And they can contact us there, and we'll be happy to provide them all the information. So we got a little bit more work to get done, but I feel very optimistic about the work before the end of the year.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us, Congressman Henry Cuellar, and thank you to our viewers for joining us. We'll see you again soon.